Thanks for joining us here today. I'm Chris Corde. I am the Senior Director of Product for Security Operations here at Google. That's basically all of our products that power security operations detection and response, which is Chronicle SIEM, Chronicle SOAR, the Mandiant set of products, as well as our threat intel platform and VirusTotal. I'm joined by Aldrich. He's the head of security engineering and security operations at CME Group. He's one of our customers that are on the security operations transformation journey with us. And so we're excited to have him here to talk a little bit about what CME Group has gone through and how they've transformed their security operations. So I started my security career back in 2004 at a company called RSA Security. And the reality is, I think when you look at the past 20 years or so, we really haven't come that far as a security industry in terms of solving our core true operational challenge from a security perspective. At RSA, we were a company that had probably a pretty high degree of sophistication. We were a company that had a high degree of tooling. We were a company that had a high degree of expertise in-house. We used to bring customers in to our security operations center. We used to show off all the visibility, all the advancement, all the capability that we had internally. But unfortunately, in 2011, we were subjected to one of the largest, I would say, most high-profile breaches that have occurred over the last, 20 years or so, which was the RSA Secure ID token breach. There's a really good Wired article about it if you really want to read and understand what happened during the token breach. But the reality was, we had a team internally that was tracking and looking at log information in a very highly manual and labor-intensive way, right? And again, this is back in 2011. And we were collecting a lot of information, but there was really no understanding of truly what was happening in the environment. And the attacker came into the environment in a fairly non-sophisticated way. It was a standard phishing attack, right? And ultimately, they got a user to click on something they shouldn't have clicked on, took advantage of a zero-day exploit. After that, made their way through the back-end systems of RSA and ultimately reached a database of 70 million secure ID token seeds. And it was a sophisticated nation-state attacker, and their goal was to basically exfiltrate those token seeds and try to break into U.S. government federal infrastructure by using secure ID as kind of the door into those environments. But the problem that we saw at the time was that we really had no, I think, true understanding of how to look at and really evaluate whether an attacker was sitting inside our environment. And it actually wasn't until we called in Mandiant at the time, again, this is back in 2011, to actually inform us of all the attack patterns and all the attack paths that the attacker actually went through, that we even understood exactly what happened. And again, we were a company that did not have any lack of sophistication from a security perspective. And the reason why I bring this up is, the reality is, we haven't come that far. The Mandiant M-Trends report, if you're interested in really understanding what the attack landscape looks like and what attackers are up to on a regular basis, I recommend that everyone read that report. It comes out every year. It's got a ton of good statistics and understanding of what attackers are up to. This is a stat from last year's, this year's 2023 M-Trends report. 63% of organizations or 63% of incidents still result in external entities informing the organization that they've been breached. And so you take, 15, 20 years of innovation that we've had, all of the advancement in security operations tooling, all the advancement in how we deal with, adversary awareness and, sophisticated security tools, all the money that's gone into security investment. And the reality is still in 2/3 of the cases, organizations don't even know they're breached, right? And that's pretty shocking, when you think about it. We haven't come all that far from an industry perspective, even after all this investment. The other thing that's interesting is that, adversaries are still pretty much using similar techniques that they used, 15, 20 years ago. If you look at the M-Trends report from last year, over 50% of incidents that occurred came in through similar attack vectors that we got breached in back in RSA, 15 years ago, which is malware exploitation and phishing. And you would think that we would have solved those problems by now, to be honest with you. I mean, those are fairly well understood attack vectors. Everyone kind of knows what it's like to have, malware running in the environment, how to evaluate malware. Everyone knows what phishing looks like. But that's still the vast majority of cases in terms of how breaches are happening or how breaches are getting into the system. And attackers, they're just getting used to getting around controls. They understand how to leverage, different types of techniques and different types of, use cases to get around common controls. But I still think we have a long way to come in terms of just having our defense tooling, catching up to where we need to get it to. The other thing is that, attackers are consistently innovating even within those attack vectors, right? And so if you look at the amount of new malware families that are being published every single year, over 588 new malware families were identified. Forget about the ones that were created, just the ones that were identified by malware, by Mandiant in the latest M-Trends report, which is a pretty shocking number. If you compare that back to where things were 10 years ago, it's probably 10x the number of malware families that are being identified on a regular basis. And so the reality is, and this is no surprise, attackers are going to keep innovating. Attackers are going to keep advancing their approaches. Even if they're using common techniques, they're going to keep trying to find ways to get around what you're doing to try to defend yourself. The other big reason I think that, we're seeing a lack of ability for organizations to actually properly defend themselves is, to be honest, there are many ways using legacy tooling. I like to refer to SIEMs as being the ultimate do-it-yourself tool. It's basically like, here's a log aggregation platform, here's a way of storing and collecting a bunch of information, and then good luck. Everything else is up to you. And that's actually the exact same thing we were doing back in 2011 when RSA was breached, right? We were just collecting a lot of information. We had no idea what to look for, how to look for it. We knew a little bit. We had some reasonably good security analysts, but there wasn't any actually security intelligence built into the SIEM. And I think that's still largely where things stand today with legacy SIEM technology. The reality is 95% of the workflow is manual. 95% of the intelligence that you bring to the table is done internally by the people that are operating the SIEM. And we just haven't seen an advancement to a more outcome-oriented solution. I kind of juxtapose that a lot to the endpoint space. I think endpoint has done a reasonably good job in advancing from being just a forensic collection platform to being an actual security-focused, tool, and really an outcome-oriented tool. And the reality is I think we need SIEMs to kind of move in that same direction and become more outcome-oriented in order for us to be able to solve this problem. The second issue that you run into with SIEMs is that even when you are just, trying to collect data and that's all you're trying to do, 99 times out of 100, you're not collecting enough of it, either because of cost or scale reasons, right? And so almost every single customer I talk to, for one reason or another, they're compromising the amount of information that they're sending to their back-end SIEM, either because they don't feel like the SIEM can handle it because they're dealing with on-premise legacy infrastructure, or because they just don't want to pay the money because they're being metered on an ingest basis for every single piece of data that they send into the SIEM. The other analogy or another story I like to use is I used to run product for an endpoint detection and response company before I joined Google a couple of years ago. The number one feature request that I always got was export data filtering, meaning that all customers wanted to do is take all this good information that we were collecting from an endpoint perspective and filter it so that they can send it to their SIEM in a filtered format, just simply because they didn't want to deal with the scale or cost implications. And I'm not talking about alerting, right? It's fine to be able to quiet down your alerts, but I'm just talking about raw forensic information. There was no reason that people should have been filtering that data before it got to the SIEM, because you really want to use that for investigation and forensics. But the reality is people really needed to do that, just simply from a cost and scale perspective. And the last piece is, like I mentioned, there's no what I would call outcome-oriented solution. Right? There's no ability for you to tie in understanding of what attackers are doing in traditional SIEM environments, right? You look at the leaders in the SIEM space, not to pick on any individual one, but the reality is they're not truly, security companies that have a real deep understanding of security behavior, right? And one of the main reasons that we purchased Mandiant, last year was really so that we can enhance our ability to truly understand what attackers are up to, enhance our ability to truly deliver that on top of a scalable data platform with Chronicle. And so when I look at where SIEM needs to go and where security operations needs to go in the future, it really comes down to these 5 things in our mind. The first is, it sounds fairly simple, but we need to stop being reactive and we need to move into a more proactive stance. I think you've seen a lot of this in cloud infrastructure, and you've seen this pretty well from a cloud infrastructure point of view, where people are really pushing towards a more proactive understanding of where risk exists in your cloud infrastructure, how your posture is kind of set up and where you might have misconfigurations, and how do you patch the holes that might exist in order for an attacker not to be able to get in the first place. We have to bring that level of awareness into security operations, right? The reality is you really don't have a lot of context about the environment that you're trying to protect in a traditional SIEM. From our point of view, we're looking to change that. We're looking to really bring that understanding proactively of what adversaries are doing, where you might be exposed, how do we validate that your controls are in the right place at the right time, and how do we adjust and understand based on business risk what you should be most focused on at any given time, and do that proactively, not just reactively based on a threat. The second is, you just can't, everything can't be manual, everything can't be people dependent all the time. You obviously need to have really good people sitting in front of the screen, but we have to bring some intelligence into the equation, but we also have to bring some ability to remove manual effort and manual toil. And, we've all seen a lot of the information about AI come out over the last year. The reality is there's a significant amount of opportunity now that exists with advanced AI functionality to really remove a high degree of manual toil from people's day-to-day lives in everyday use cases like security operations. And I think we're starting to prove that with a lot of the things that we're integrating into everything, all the products around Google Cloud, but especially on the security side, where we can really get to the point where we have AI-guided and assisted investigation and response, right? Where it's not just about a human needing to, use AI for one particular part of the workflow, but instead we actually have a highly trained, highly tuned AI, engine really guiding and leading you toward an investigative path, which I'll talk about that more in a second. The third is about moving away from just having threat intel feeds and just overlaying threat intel data in a more, what I would call, blind fashion, to really applying threat intel in a much more curated outcome-driven fashion. And what I mean by that is it should be mostly the job of the vendor, in my opinion, to really apply threat intel in the right way. And that's not the way I think most security operations organizations run. It's not the way most SIEMs run, to be honest with you. Most SIEMs run, the whole idea of having a threat intel platform, a TIP, that whole market, exists because people are trying to aggregate, collect, and align their threat intel feeds to make sense out of them for their own SIEM environment, which by definition is a really odd thing to ask someone to do, right? We should be the ones, as vendors or other SIEM vendors, should be the ones that are helping you apply the right intelligence at the right times, right? And we should be able to do that through this notion of curated outcomes, where you just come in, flip a switch, say you're looking to understand the latest breach analytics, you want mandiant intelligence to be applied across your data, and we should be able to do that in a much more automated and much more curated fashion. The third is around, driving contextual awareness and contextual information and when you're dealing with investigation and response. And that, it kind of moves away from this notion of just dealing with alerts, right? We don't want to, obviously an alert is the thing that you want to be able to be notified about. But the reality is we have to provide you the right level of context when you're performing your investigative tasks. One way we're doing this in Chronicle, which I'll talk about in a second, is this idea of cloud detection and response, where when you're dealing with an event or an alert inside of your cloud environment, we actually augment and tell you everything you need to know about the context of that asset or that entity that you're investigating around. And using that context, you can make much more well-informed decisions, right? And we do that because we know a lot about the environment in which you're operating in, because you're running inside of Google Cloud. But you can also apply that same level of contextual awareness anywhere in the infrastructure, as long as we bring in the right level of information. And then the last piece is you should never have to worry about being capacity constrained or cost constrained, right? That should not be a consideration that ever has to enter into a security operation professional's mind. And so that's one thing I think we've solved right from the beginning with Chronicle, which is just you flip the switch, it's a SaaS-driven surface, it's what we call infinitely scalable, it runs on the same backbone that search and YouTube and Gmail run on top of. And so we have the ability of just dealing with large data volumes, searching through those data volumes at a way higher performant rate than any other vendor that's out there today. And so what we've done with the integration of Chronicle Simplify, which was now renamed Chronicle SOAR, the Mandiant portfolio, as well as our Intel information that have come from Google's internal threat analysis group, as well as VirusTotal, has kind of integrated all this into one overarching security operations platform. And the reality is, we're able to cover a pretty wide swath of all the things that I talked about, previously, by combining all these technologies together and really running on top of the world's most scalable data lake and Chronicle from the ground up. And there's kind of three core things that I would always point to, and customers ask, like, what are the big things that Chronicle does that's different than what you're going to get in market today? The first is just that ability to run and operate at Google scale and Google speed. Right, so I mentioned the fact that Chronicle was built from the ground up on top of the same infrastructure that powers our consumer-facing applications. And that's true. Like, one of the interesting tidbits about Chronicle was actually developed for an internal use case inside of Google to be able to power our own internal security operations. And it was actually built before Google Cloud was kind of even a thing. And so we built it on top of an infrastructure called Borg inside of Google, which is the same backbone that runs our consumer-facing applications. And so we can, we've proven, I think, pretty consistently that we can pull in and scale large amounts of information, store that information for 12 months by default in hot storage, and search through that information faster than any other vendor that's out there. And right there, you get a pretty, amazing benefit, which is the fact that you don't have to worry about filtering information arbitrarily, and we can deliver that to you at a cost profile that's way more attractive than what you're going to get with other vendors because we're operating on top of our own infrastructure. The second piece is we're able to take what I believe is the world's best threat intelligence, I think almost definitely more than any other SIEM vendor out there, but I would argue over any other even security vendor out there. And we're able to apply that on top of your data at high degrees of scale. And so when I talk about the world's best in threat intelligence, I want you to think about a few things. First, think about the breadth of information that Google has access to. I think there's 2.5 billion or so people in the world that are using Chrome on a daily basis. That's like, 30% of the world's population every single day using Chrome browsers. Google's able to understand and see attacker activity and the attack surface across that level of scale through, initiatives like safe browsing. We're actually looking at malware downloads, through Chrome. We're able to do that through Gmail by evaluating phishing attacks. And so when you have this wide scale of billions of users, and you have the ability of understanding the attacker landscape across that level of population, it's very, very, very unlikely that any other specific security vendor could even come close to that level of breadth. And we've always had that level of breadth, inside of Google, and we store all that information in a back-end, team called TAG, which is the threat analysis group inside of Google. A few years ago, probably 10 years ago, we augmented that by buying VirusTotal. VirusTotal is the world's preeminent malware and IOC, reputation database. It aggregates information across, every single AV vendor, every single, vendor that's sending in domain-based information about IOC and potential attack vectors there. And I think we have over 2.4 billion entries inside of VirusTotal. And so we have a fairly wide footprint just understanding the attack landscape and the attack surface, just given that level of breadth, right? There's not many other vendors that can look at that level of breadth across the board. With Mandiant, what we were able to do is augment that with a significant amount of depth, right? And so what Mandiant does is tracks specific threat actor behavior. It tracks specific threat campaigns. They have direct researchers that are out there looking at specific attacker activity. And they're proving that, like, on the front lines by actually operating real incident response engagements with customers every single day. And so when you combine that level of breadth with that level of depth that Mandiant is bringing to the table, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of most of the people inside of Google, you're going to get the world's best threat intelligence. And the idea is not just to have that threat intel and hand it to a customer and say, figure it out yourself. The idea is to what we call apply that threat intelligence inside a product. And what we mean by that is every single event that comes into Chronicle, we want to enrich and augment that event with threat intelligence from the ground up. We could be ingesting trillions of events for any given customer at any given time. Every single one of those we want to run through our threat intel platforms We want to see if it's associated with a malware family. We want to see if it's associated with a campaign. We want to see if it's associated with a threat actor. And then we want to take the metadata that we see about association and append it to the event so that you have it as part of your core investigative workflow every time you have an event inside of Chronicle. We then want to also do analysis on top of those events to see if any of those things we think are highly indicative of active breaches. And that's a feature inside of Chronicle that we call breach analytics. And so that's what I mean by applied threat intelligence. When you're dealing with, number one, needing to have access to the world's best intel, but number two, needing to apply that access at scale, I really don't think any other SIEM vendor out there is coming close to what we're able to do inside of Chronicle from that perspective. And then the third is this notion of AI-infused productivity, right? And so all the things that you're seeing with ChatGPT, all of the sort of momentum that's been happening around AI lately, all of that has really been technology and capability that was first researched and open sourced by Google back in 2017. And so, I think it's fairly easy to say that if anyone can apply large-scale AI approaches into security and do it well, that Google is a great organization to be able to do that. And the reality is, in order for you to be able to apply AI at scale and do it well, you're going to need to do that on top of large amounts of information. And so the Chronicle value proposition kind of feeds on itself here, because the more information that we have at any given time to be able to train the model, the better off we are in actually operating true AI advancement on top of a customer security operations profile. Here's just a proof point from one of our customers and talking about how Chronicle has reduced mean time to resolution. I love this quote. It's one of the things that we take most pride in, which is how do we help a customer actually tangibly improve their return on investment and actually really help them reduce mean time to resolution. And the reality is, when you stack a lot of these capabilities and these benefits together, you start to see really true tangible results from customers like this who are truly able to demonstrate and measure how they see security operations changing inside their environment. I talked about our ability to apply intel. Here's some additional statistics. The big thing I'd like to point out here is just the size of the Mandiant research team. And so not only do we run over 1,400 incident response engagements a year where we're out there in the trenches with customers operating the latest and greatest incidents, but we also have, I think, a world-class, if not the best, research team that's performing direct intel research every single day with over 500 analysts. And so probably the two biggest breaches that you've heard about over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, which is the Log4j breach and the SolarWinds breach, both of those things were identified. The campaign families, the attackers, and the techniques were all identified by that Mandiant research team, right? And so these are the kind of people that are working every single day to really bring and apply those threat intelligence capabilities into Chronicle and into security operations at Google. This is just an example of cloud detection and response. I know a lot of the room's probably Google Cloud customers, and this is just a way in which we bring contextual awareness to the equation to help you perform your detection and response activities, right? And the reality is what we're able to do is take our understanding of the attacker landscape, deliver curated detections inside of Chronicle where I can just simply flip a switch and turn on cloud detections. But then when I do see alerts, I'm able to leverage the context, the understanding of the infrastructure landscape, to make it easier for you to pivot and understand what that alert really means in context, right? Which machine is it on? What entity is it on? What is that entity performing? What is it connected to? What's the associated risk of that entity, right? And how important is it for me to deal with this incident right now? All of those things are what we mean by contextual awareness, right? And that's what effectively is bubbled up into cloud detection and response. The other thing that we announced yesterday is something called Mandiant Hunt for Chronicle. This is where we take that really powerful team of 500 analysts and intel researchers that are in the back end. We have a team that's performing operational kind of detection and response every day for hundreds of customers. And what we do is we layer that on top of Chronicle information. And so if you're a Chronicle customer, inside your Chronicle tenant, you can effectively have the Mandiant team perform what we call silent hunting, where they deploy a set of hunting rules, they deploy a set of emerging threat indicator rules, and they effectively just perform ongoing threat hunts to look for attacker activity happening in your environment. And if they see anything, they can bubble that right up to you and basically alert you that there's something significant that you should look at. So this is a great way of, what I would call getting that operational outcome by leveraging the world's best experts on top of a platform that's scalable for the future. And then the last thing I'll point out before Eric comes up here and talks about his journey is, what we've delivered with Duet AI and Chronicle. right? And this is, I think a capability that right now is what I would call human-led and AI-assisted, where the human is actually prompting the LLM and the SecPalm model behind the scenes to basically make it easier to perform tasks that are somewhat cumbersome and manual in nature to perform, like writing searches in our search language, which is Unified Data Model, or like writing rules in our rule language, which is YARL. While those things are doable, it's much easier to be able to ask a machine to do it and do it very quickly. Where we're going with this is actually really pushing it beyond just being human-led and AI-assisted to what we call, AI-guided based investigation. So what we've done is we've trained the SecPalm model with basically every single research report that Mandiant has published, with everything that exists inside of VirusTotal. And so think about the Duet AI capability in Chronicle as being the world's best threat researcher and threat analyst sitting right alongside you in product. And so as we move into next year, what you'll start to see in this investigation panel on the right-hand side is it prompting you on things that you should look at in your data set based on what it sees as potential malicious activity. And that's what we mean by AI-guided based investigation, where it's actually helping you along the way and making you better at your job on a regular basis. And these are the kind of things that, honestly, I don't think any other vendor can really come close to, mostly because they don't have the intel to be able to train the model, but also just because they don't have the AI capability to be able to deliver it. So that said, it's one thing to listen to me, but it's also a much better thing to listen to customers talk about their journey. So I just want to welcome Eric on the stage to talk about CME.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and I want to thank Google and Chris and our Googler partners for the opportunity to share with you CME's journey through modernizing its security operations. With its 175-year history, CME Group is a place where the world comes to manage risk. Using our benchmark products, our customers can trade options, futures, optimize portfolios, and analyze vast data sets. My name is Eric Aldrich, and I am part of CME Group's information security team. I work with technology and business leaders throughout CME Group to help CME safely take advantage of new business opportunities. What I'd like to share with you today is our journey as we modernize our security operations. We're still early in our journey, but we like what we're seeing, and I think we're headed in the right direction. So first, I'd like to go through some of the drivers that we have considered both internally and externally as we're kind of establishing that journey. I'd like to talk about some of the principles that we used for our planning to sort of center ourselves as we move forward. I'd like to share some of the outcomes that we're expecting out of that journey as we move through using the people, process, and technology framework. And then I'd like to kind of share how we've stacked up some of the deliverables that we're going to be performing through our journey, and then I'll close. So CME has embarked on a digital transformation, right, with its partner Google in this transformation. And one of the things that we're looking for is new ways of providing value and innovation to our customers at a pace that we can increase, right? So that our digital transformation allows us to provide value, new products to our customers more quickly. So my team is responsible for helping to, safely allow the business to move into those new opportunities. So we had to carefully think about how we were going to help the business approach that digital transformation. So one of the things that we focused on was really what the value of our business, our security business within CME Group, what did we want that value to be? Because we needed to ground what we were doing in certain principles that would help us move forward. And we knew that we would have some failures, but that we needed these principles and values to make sure that we were always able to center ourselves on our journey. So the values that we typically the value for an information security team might be expressed as, to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your company's data and systems. I would argue that that is important, but it doesn't fully express what the value of a security team can provide. And that is, as Chris mentioned, focusing more on the outcomes that the business wants and the business's ability to compete through providing innovation and new products to its customers. So we focused on what that value would be and what we would need to do in order to focus on delivering that value. And as an analogy I like to use to illustrate that is the difference between a guard dog and a sheepdog, right? A guard dog goes to work every day expecting its environment to be exactly the same as it was the day before, the week before, the month before. The guard dog has a bunch of infrastructure that it uses to protect the environment. It has a fence outside of the fence and inside of the fence. It has a building, maybe the crown jewels, right? And the guard dog is good at that, right? That's been a good kind of structure. But what if the opportunities of that business move elsewhere? What if the customers move elsewhere? That's not a model that is really going to help that business compete and safely provide new innovation to its customers. The sheepdog, on the other hand, goes to work every day knowing, expecting that its environment is going to change, and it has built change and dynamics into the way that it protects the flock, right? So that flock can move to new opportunities any day if that's what's needed. And the sheepdog understands how to manage risk for that flock in a way that brings the risk profile within the company's risk or the flock's risk appetite, so to speak. So part of what we needed to do is really understand what our value is and change our culture and our mindset in providing that value. And so we needed to rethink the way that we were doing that. Our macro world, let's be real here, right? It can be crazy, right? If you think about all the external factors that create threats for us, the slightest little kind of global event creates a cascade of phishing emails and cyber attacks that we have to protect ourselves against. The technologies are constantly changing. And if you think about where we're actually doing work and where our data is, it's everywhere on anything at any time, right? So that's an external risk that we needed to provide safe passes for, so to speak, for our company. Talent as well is, this is not a new issue for any of us. We all know that we all need, cyber staff, and there's a lot of openings that are just unfilled, right? I've heard here in a couple of sessions that there are hundreds of thousands, if not, millions of openings that can't be filled. Part of the reason for that is because we sort of need these cybersecurity unicorns, right? And there's just not enough of them. And so, information security, unfortunately, is still a bit of a black art. You still need people who are very well-versed, very tenured and well-versed in, security protocols and network protocols and attackers and all this stuff. Rate of change is also something that is, a risk as well, right? Because if you think about how technology and the way that we work has changed over the last decade, right? We had first moving from on-prem to cloud, then we had our supply chain moving to the cloud, and then we had, the pandemic and everybody's working from home, and then you have machine learning, AI, generative AI, all these new things that are creating risks constantly. Rate of change has another side to it that probably should have been included on the first slide, but rate of change is a risk for my team if we can't change at the rate that the company wants to change. So if we can't provide security services at the rate that the company needs to provide value to its customers, we become a blocker. So that's a risk that we're trying to address as well. So when we were talking about the journey and the plan that we wanted to create, we identified some principles, and I won't read everything on this slide here, but we identified some important principles, again, so that we knew that this is a long journey and we're just starting out, and we knew that we would go off path, right? So we needed some principles to be able to bring us back to our bearing And some of those principles are here. So one of the most important ones that we identified was, if you're doing something today, don't continue that, right? Because that thing that you're doing today, you designed it for a legacy environment, right? And you don't want to carry that over into the new way of being more flexible and providing value to the business. We need to be more dynamic in things that we created in the legacy or traditional version of ourselves, likely wouldn't carry forward. So sometimes you're in a meeting and you hear somebody say, hey, we've always done it that way. That's a huge red flag, right? So we want to make sure that we're being proactive about identifying things that we need to change. Again, we need to understand who our customers are within the business. We're a business within CME Group, and we have various customers. We have business customers. My engineering team has the SOC as a customer, right? And so we need to focus on what those particular business customers needed and when they needed, the rate that they needed it, and how dynamic we needed to be in doing that. And we need to make sure that we were doing that in a safe way. The other principle is we need to prepare our teams for this change. This is really about a cultural change, a way of sharing the impact that we want to have with the business. So moving away from that kind of like we're providing confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and expanding that to provide safe deployments of new features and innovation to our customers at the rate that the business needs to do it. And we needed to really work with our teams to get out of that, I'm task-based, I'm creating this security widget, to really having a broader mindset to say, how is what I'm doing today going to make the business successful? We wanted to move away from the waterfall kind of project-based kind of deploying these, 8, 12-month long projects, right? We needed to if we're going to be more dynamic, we needed to break our services up into chunks that could be delivered to the business on an incremental basis so that the business can move as quickly as it needed to move. So we needed to learn how to iterate. We needed to learn to be comfortable with dropping in a minimum viable product versus this gigantic 12-month project. And that works because the business is iterating as well. And so we allow the business to drop in their MVP, we put in our MVP, and we make sure that what we're putting in obviously needs to reduce the risk of that deployment within our risk appetite, but you will find ways to break up your services and your products into ways that allows them to be deployed in a way that allows the business to be dynamic. Of course, we need to increment those things, and so we need to have a system. CME Group is using the agile methodology now to make sure that we can be dynamic with the business, and we're working in the same kind of cadence and cycle that the business is. And we want to keep things moving. We want those increments to keep happening so that we keep adding maturity to those deployments, those initial deployments. Finally, we want to delete things. And by deleting, I don't mean like, hey, we're not really doing this anymore, so maybe we shouldn't anymore. What I mean is proactively looking for things, hunting for things that you can kill. And the reason you need to do that is because those are consuming resources that you can reapply into your transformation. And so that's important. So you can find those things in cultural, the way that people think about what they're providing. You can find that in procedural debt, technical debt, and financial debt. All these things have areas that you can hunt for and reapply those investments. So we talked a little bit about the drivers, and now I'll share some of the outcomes that we're looking for using people process technology. We want to make sure that our people, as I mentioned before, are outcome oriented, that they're looking for the complete picture. They're not creating, security widgets, blind to what their impact to the business is. We need to make sure that everybody on the team knows what the business goal is and that they're supporting that in their role in security. We need to make sure that our people are empowered, right? That we don't have to have people working in a vertical organization silo that has to ask permission from their manager to go talk to another department, right? So as part of our agile transformation, we're also creating horizontally based teams that have all the skill sets needed to create solutions without having to spend a lot of time escalating, and they can solve problems in the 2-week sprints that they have, and that helps us be very dynamic and help the business provide value to our customers. With the empowerment comes accountability, right? And so with that, with those horizontal teams, they're accountable for delivering on the planning, and there are lessons that we'll learn from that, and we'll reapply that into the process. We want to relocate our people's value, right? We want to get our people into the OODA loop as quickly as possible, right? Like we need security unicorns because there's a lot of manual toil, context generation, summarization. You have to know how to connect all that data that's in your SIM, and you need a very tenured person in order to be able to do that effectively in a way that you can protect your company. We want to be able to democratize access to that analysis and decision-making phase to maybe people that might not be as tenured, that might be more junior, right? So that we can have easier access to security candidates, right? Security team members, and we also can keep our humans in the place that they're best at, right? People get burned out and they leave because of the manual work that they have to do, and they're not in the space that they're good at, which is analysis and decision making. Process outcomes that we wanted our process to be dynamic. We want them to provide a lot of context, and we wanted them to be extremely queryable. And some of the tools that Google provides, the Chronicle SIM and the natural language processing, we've been able to begin using some of these tools that provide this rich data set and keep our analysts in that OODA loop more often. We want our processes to also be coded and unsupervised. We have a lot of documentation. We have hundreds of triage procedures, run books, playbooks, incident response procedures. Many of those things can be automated. And so we want an outcome that we want of our processes is to take as much of that stuff that is rote and can be put into code and do that. We want to make sure that those things are measured and optimized so that we can take those learnings and improve our processes. And so we've kind of recoined the site reliability engineering term to kind of security reliability engineering on our team. And so we want to make sure that we're measuring those things as well so that we can always be learning and improving. For technology, that's the dessert for most of us. That's the thing that we always run to first. It's fun to play with the technology, and we have as well. But we want to make sure that our technology is really being driven by the first two people in process and supporting those things. And so we want our technology to be process oriented. We don't want technology silos and point solutions. We want a process of protection. What's the outcome that we want out of the process? And we want tools that can support that. And Chronicle SIM has that broad visibility across the enterprise field of view, so that as our company is connecting together the Google services that we're using to create innovation and products, those things automatically flow into the systems that we're using with Google, Chronicle, SOAR, UEBA tools, right? Those things automatically come in, and we don't need to spend a lot of time building infrastructure to protect those things. Finally, we want the technology to provide context. We want the ability for those, we will need extremely tenured people, but we also want the more junior people to be able to perform effectively as well. And so we want to make sure that the technology we're using, like the Duet AI and some of the other features that are being added to Chronicle SIM, we want to make sure that those things enable, democratize access to the security functions to more of our team. So quickly on our transformation of modern operations, we stacked up our deliverables into 4 phases, and between those phases, we also have a pause, right, so that we can internalize and build muscle memory and train on what we learned in each of the phases. And essentially, phase 1 is really about delivering that MVP, putting an initial set of context in there, discovering the differences or the gaps between what you're doing in your on-prem environment and how you would need to refactor and transform those things into the Chronicle SIM environment. Then we paused. We did a bunch of testing. Google was, very a very good partner as far as helping us to create, excuse me, training and capture the flags so that we could build that muscle memory and our team could learn what this stuff actually looks like in the real world. And then phase 2 is about building on that content, adding some maturity, moving to Agile for our team as well. And we're in the middle of phase 2 and phase 3 right now. Phase 3 is going to be about adding more automation, moving more firmly towards autonomous SOC operations, adding machine learning and artificial intelligence, learning how to use AI workbench and some of the tools that we're previewing right now and maturing our use of these products. And then phase 4 is really about normalizing all these things and making them become BAU so that we could run them on our own, and then sort of getting the keys handed over towards us so that we can, carry that forward in a BAU state. So putting it all together, this is really about a mindset shift for our team, right? The technology obviously important and we're using that, but it's really about having your team understand what the outcome is that the team needs to have, and that is a broad business outcome. Planning is the key to success in that we have to make sure that we have a plan and some principles so that if we come off course that we're guided back on, and then just, then execute. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand this back to Chris, I think.
The survey, and please, give us some feedback. I don't think we have any time for live questions, but Eric and I will both be up here after the session, so if you're interested in asking us any questions, by all means come up. I'm happy to chat. And thanks again for everyone taking the time to join us this morning. We appreciate it.